All right, I thought I would talk a little bit about men, women, and socialism, Islam, and why it's all connected somewhat, and also a little bit on willful ignorance in the face of catastrophe and cowardice. So obviously, femininity can be fear-driven, sort of. When you may, okay. I'm using vague terms here in a sense, but like, you know what I mean. Women tend to be more afraid than men typically in terms of danger and so on. So you know, how do I put this? Okay, so socialism is pedophile matriarchy, and Islam is pedophile patriarchy, and Christianity is godly men and women, basically. Patriarchy somewhat, but a little bit of extra freedom for women underneath the patriarchs compared to Islam. A sort of middle ground that has its cake and eats it too a little bit, somewhat, basically. Um, Ordered liberty, maximizing freedom and safety versus anarcho tyranny and you know, like there's ways of organizing society that maximize things and minimize things and so on. And really, you just got to learn what actually does it to some extent. You know, you can't just take the people's own words for it that that's what they represent. You have to look at the impacts and like psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, and pedophiles all seem to be ganging up and seeking power and scratching each other's backs at the expense of the other 80% of humanity to some extent. And like the only way they keep in power is by getting the 80% to leech as well in on the leeching off of the rest of whoever's left over. The 60 or 70% of people that aren't parasites. Um, and they organize systems of dysfunction and looting and cheating and so on. Cheating on your spouse, cheating the taxpayer, cheating the system, not paying your fair share, which I know the socialists use as a term, but like honestly, like, what is your fair share, Yeah, I would say it's like 20% maybe, or 10% or something like that, like, or maybe 30%, somewhere in there, 10, 20, 30% total, even for a welfare state at most, basically. And like, the rest is like yours, basically, for your family at least. So, like 85% for your family at least, basically. And so on. And, you see this feminization and this corruption and so on in the workforce where the women are basically like they're just socializing and doing meetings and stuff like that. They're never actually doing the work, the legwork or the groundwork necessary to do the basics of the company. And then you wonder why their products are shit. And the effeminate, sorry, because the feminine is divine, just like the masculine on some level, but effeminate is like when you're pushing men specifically to be like women, and you wonder why there's so many transsexuals and so on. Because basically the men naturally see the stuff and go like, oh, what if I'm a woman and then I'll get these benefits too? And the system is rigged against men. And I know it's kind of a bitch and moan thing, but like when you think about it, it's like the system is rigged against men and white men and so on. Yeah. So that's the third worldism, Islam, Hinduism, Africans, and so on. Um, the socialists. Sargon was mentioning that the socialists want to turn Britain into communist Lebanon, replace the white people, and form a parasitical state, totalitarian wise, controlling and dominating and tyrannizing the masses and so on. And as we see, this just collapses in on itself, and the foreigners take over, and you get a third world shithole. It's absolute treason, basically. It's like actual treason. Like, you should hang people for this kind of thing, basically, if you could, basically. Um, but the mechanism is they make men effeminate, and they encourage women in the workforce and men's spaces and so on, um, to prevent masculinity from thriving or growing and so on, because the men would naturally, if they were unified on some level, which is more likely because a brotherhood is more likely than a sisterhood in terms of raw organizational capacity and so on, and tendency for men to organize into groups based on hobbies and interests and so on, um, or something like that, than women are typically, unless they're personally rewarded. The men will sacrifice for the cause in a way that women just won't. So that's why it's so skewed and so on. Um, Political corruption is a very womanly game, basically, in the end, through the instincts. A woman's instincts are good for the family, but they're not good for society at large when they're in control. And that's one of the reasons why they make men effeminate, because they want men to act like women, so that everyone's confused about what the right thing to do is, and that's why they do feminism and so on. And it doesn't, um, it doesn't. It's no accident that feminism rose when living standards began to decline noticeably, consistently. Um, and it was the communists and so on that pushed feminism in the first place. So, and communism always leads to starvation, mass death, and tyranny, like every time. And they say socialism is the road to communism. And it's like, yeah, it is. So social democracy and democratic socialism are the road to socialism, which is the road to communism. Yeah, I mean, it's that obvious. Anyways, so, um, basically, what is masculine in this case, right? What is masculine in this case? Setting down boundaries, enforcing them, uh, letting the woman watch over the children, and the man watches over the woman and the children. Maybe less watching of the children than the woman, but a little bit of it, and in his unique manly way in terms of understanding things, and justice. Justice is a man's domain, basically. Um, Punishing wrongdoing is a man's domain. A woman is temperamentally, generally not capable of enforcing justice. Now, justice is an abstract principle, and one of the things about men is they're more code of conduct oriented than women are, who are interpersonal oriented. So there's a social vibe, but there's also a code of honor and conduct system that men put into place. And women naturally don't like that system because it constrains them in the wider society. But when they're with a man, I'll go back for a second, but put a pin on that for a second, and I'll explain a little bit of stuff. Feminists don't believe they can get a good man who'll do that for their family. So they look for the state to do it. But the thing is, the mechanisms of the state are naturally the the mechanisms of civilization are masculine. The entire social order that is safe in general is derived from masculine virtues enforced on society as a whole. And when women pollute the social sphere in terms of the authority figures and influencers and so on, um, like look at the View. You know what I mean? You could replace them with a pack of feral, shrieking hogs, and you wouldn't get anything different. You know, no one would notice. But if you replace the View with actual manly men, then it would end up like Tucker Carlson or Tim Pool, sort of, or like Sargon, or like it would be like Nick Freitas or something. You know what I mean? So basically, what we need to do is we need to transform society at the same time as rebelling against the state. We need to initiate, as Richard IV or the Sacred Way says, initiate people into masculinity. We can't just rail against the state and say it's evil and so on. We have to provide an actual solution, an alternative to it. And it has to be done person by person on some level. You can kind of shortcut it by being an influential person and reaching a lot of people as one person if you got these ideas. But really what needs to be done is every single person needs to internalize this knowledge of how the society works and so on. And I'm not going to get into too much detail beyond what I've already said about masculinity and so on, but it's a very simple hierarchy based on violence, generosity, apparently, and competency in conflict, whether the corporate boardroom or combat, like actual fighting physically, or something like that. Mental and physical capacity for conflict resolution and standing up for those you care about and so on. And the feminists, you'll notice the suffragettes and so on, were basically the woman with shit men or no man whatsoever. And the feminists are basically the same kind of thing. They didn't get a good man, and they don't expect to get a good man, so they want society to take care of them like it's their husband or father, basically. But of course, naturally, because women get into social positions of authority, pollutes the masculine-centered civilization core of the nation and its political mechanisms, then the entire game is effeminized, and then you get women controlling women and men, not men controlling women and men. And that just naturally doesn't work for a long time. It collapses in on itself, and it's full of corruption and so on, because women don't have virtue the same way a man does. It's not as important to them. They're concerned with prosperity, safety, and emotional comfort for them and the children, because they have to take care of babies and stuff, which means, as Jordan Peterson points out, when the first 6 months of the baby's always right, and it just has to be that way, or like it'll die. And it's like the woman is naturally disposed towards that position, but the man is the one who disciplines the child when they get older into being a proper adult. The woman can offer her own insights and so on, but like the man has to be the order maker and so on. And like they say, it's a walled garden where the man builds the walls and mans the ramparts and so on, and the woman tends to the garden. Maybe there's a bunch of compounds or villages or something that are walled off with gardens. You know what I mean? So it's like, the woman would go on the road and the man would go on the road to like talk to other people in other compounds of the walled gardens and so on. But the man would also like go into the wilderness, especially when they're younger, to like fight the monsters and the beasts and the animals and the predators and hunt for prey and basically ritualize. Like it's almost like a ritual of initiation. Um, like like for a ritual of initiation for men, my dad showed me Barbarella and Conan the Barbarian and Predator 2. And my grandparents showed me the Seven Samurai and Kikujiro, which is a different. Actually, no, sorry, not Kikujiro. That's a different. That's about a kid that looks for his mother and so on. And his neighbor eventually takes him in, and after going on a journey with the kid to find the kid's mother and so on, and it's like, okay, and that's one of the things men do as well, actually. So it's like, okay, they adopt children and like take care of them and look out for younger people and so on. That's one of the things men without children will typically do, or even men with children if they're estranged from their children and so on. Um, like they'll actually do the work to take them under their wing and raise them and so on. Um, and that's part and parcel of the metaphysics of the masculine versus the feminine. And of course, the biggest daddy of all is God, and that's why he's a father, not a mother, because he's looking out for for everyone under him together, men, women, children, and that's ultimate masculinity, basically. And of course, the state, when it's not the total state, but just sort of like in its limited capacity and best functioning, not very good maybe or not perfect, but still best capacity, because we can't get rid of the state or else it's literal anarchy. I mean, that's what anarchy literally means. So, um, we want something that's ordered, liberty, maximized, with a minimal state, maximum community, and as many women taken care of by a good husband and father as possible, who's productive, protective, disciplined, and the men have to be independent somewhat. Um, and basically, that's just how it is. And that needs to be represented in the wider authority structure of society as well, and influence structure. I mean, men are doctors, women are nurses, men are CEOs, and women are secretaries. Is like the natural order. Now, all this DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, all this, um, what's it called? Something action, affirmative action. All that stuff needs to die off, basically. But the only way we're going to kill it off is if we initiate men into the process of becoming a real man, um, so that the system has a lot more enemies, and also the men who would be enemies, who or but are not yet enemies of the total state, don't look at it as the only possible option, otherwise they'll personally fail. So you need to build up men and oppose the total state in unison with a coherent worldview to explain how to behave, how to live life for maximum benefit for as many people as for that one person, that one man, that one woman, and everyone else, maximum benefit. Not literally everyone else. There's always going to be certain fringes or evil people that need to be destroyed. But most people, and even a certain degree of space relegated to the fringes of society, like a red light district or like a particularly liberal part of town or something like that. Um, but we need to work on making more people genuinely conservative in the fullest sense of the word, not just like Michael Knowles or Matt Walsh or Tim Pool or politically conservative and personally liberal, but actual conservative reactionary sort of people. We need to build men up. Like into proper men, like true men, real men, manly men, not effeminate soy boys. It's not enough to just rail against them. That's one thing. The insulting and shame of being a soy boy certainly makes people not want to do it. But you have to offer an actual positive vision as well. And that's one of the things Jordan Peterson is good about, in a way, but he's not fully masculine himself. So he's not necessarily the kind of person who could possibly do that. And that's why we run into trouble, because we've got all these shattered, splintered shards of what the ultimate man is. And I mean that's kind of how it is naturally anyways, to some extent. But we've got no role models that are like the full deal, except for like Nick Freitas on some level. And he's not exploring personally the deeper primal aspects to masculinity that underpin the raw nature red tooth and claw reality of nature, at least publicly on his podcast. He's more focused on politics. And we have to get into the psychology of what it means to be a man, basically. And like the lift bro kind of thing as well. And like the experience of being in a fight and so on. Fight Club is a movie that is popular for a reason, because Tyler Durden doesn't just create a club where people punch each other. He creates an entire outlook on life and then politicizes it. He links the political with the personal in men and builds them up into the politicians that he wants to see, basically. And that's how we're going to win. We're going to need to unite the political with the personal, the way the leftists say the political is personal. But it's going to be an entire worldview for each and every individual man, based on a wider understanding of the world and their positions in it, and how to treat women and children and so on. And that's one of the reasons why Christianity and religion is so important, because they offer some coherent, widely applicable message. But Christianity is beginning to sort of like fall apart in terms of the being lost in translation, I noticed. Like literally lost in translation, because my reading of the Bible personally, right, from basic English to reading the Bible and going like, oh, well, I don't agree with that. And then someone like looks into what it meant like 2,000 years ago, and it's like, oh, no, that's a turn of phrase. It's not literally, autistically, factually an argument for that exact thing. Um, and I'll give an example that I kind of figured out already, but like on my own or something like that. It wasn't that big of a deal. Someone told me, and I figured it out on my own a little bit too. And I was like, it's nothing special. But like when you read the Bible, there's a certain part that says, "For those who have ears, let them hear." And if you know the phrase "have an ear for it," then it's like you understand that having an ear for something means to understand it, basically. So it's not saying listen up and that's it. It's saying there's a meaning to it, and not everyone has the capacity to understand what I'm saying, but some do. So let them understand it. So like lost in translation Bible stuff is a big deal, and like Doug Wilson makes hay out of all sorts of things that the Bible says that if he didn't explain the concept, I would have been totally lost in regards to the Bible. So I think we need to form a system of belief, a rigorous interconnectedness of what it means to be a man as an individual, a man in society, and a man of God, and a man of the family, man in a family, um, and a little bit on child rearing for boys and girls. Nick Freitas is pretty good about those in his shorts and so on, and his podcast as well. So he's got answers for that, and so does Jordan Peterson. But you know, we need to combine, and I don't mean just mash together and call it middle ground and so on, but we need to finesse the interconnected influences of the personal, the political, and the familial family, and so on. Now, granted, I mentioned positions of authority and so on, and I was using society and so on a couple times, and then caught myself and said positions of authority next. So, what is a woman's position in society? Well, she is an authority to children, um, but she's more of a keep them from harm kind of authority, in terms of looking out for things they might do that would get them into danger and recognizing dangers and avoiding them. The man will introduce certain dangers to the children, or allow them to investigate certain dangerous things in a controlled environment that's age appropriate so that they can learn something for future life. That's what a man's particular drive and goal is, and to encourage adventurousness and so on, and drive and ambition and so on. At least in boys. I mean, maybe ambition to have a family for girls and so on. This is like just we have to find a way to combine Stone Age primitive tribal wisdom in regards to these things that have been known for long times in the most pure expressions of human experience back then, and combine it with a civilized, safer, more prosperous, more technically complicated world today. Basically. And that's what I mean by putting a man in his place in society as a person individually, psychologically, and in the family in relation to women. Um, so yeah. And then once we grow the army that we wish to fight for us and our desires in as a bunch of men who have authority over their own single woman, which is why monogamy is so important. We don't want men competing with other men for 10 women because there's not enough women to go around. Technically, 52% of babies are born boys and like 48% are born girls. So if we're not killing off the men, then there's more boys than girls. So it's like there's an imbalance and so on. But basically, um, we don't want to make the too many men, not enough women problem worse through monogamy and chimpanzee maiden strategy, champion maiden strategy stuff, or something like that. Um, you know, and really, we want women to have a good man who can put her in her place, which doesn't just mean punch her down, but it means like put her as above the children, below him slightly, but nearly equal, I think. I'm not sure about that one, but I think that's what's going on. And then wider society has to be masculine, and then the local neighborhood community and so on is mostly tended in terms of raw hours and time and effort and so on is tended like a garden by the woman. And the men do the wars and politics and corporate CEO boardroom stuff. The men do the programming and so on. And the women do the secretary and coffee tray pusher and nurse kind of things and so on. And that's just natural. That's just natural. And the one thing I will say is, despite the fact that it seems so impossible to get back to it, is it's natural. It works way better than all the rest of things. It's natural. It works way better than everything else. The reason why the world is so hostile to it right now is because the predators, that 20% of pedophiles, sociopaths, narcissists, and psychopaths, 20% of the population is pressing hard against it, united on one front to parasitize the rest of humanity. And like I said, they get normal people in on the parasitism to keep themselves in power, because if the normal people were to wake up and say, I'm not benefiting, there's 80% of them, so the 20% would get crushed. And their worst nightmare is to not be able to leech or prey on the rest of humanity. So, survival and thriving is victory, and tyranny is failure and defeat. And women don't have what it takes to fight for the good causes. You know, and you'll notice women don't sacrifice for causes either. They're always well rewarded, otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So it's a very gimme, gimme, gimme kind of situation. And that's why they want men to be effeminate, because then it's a very gimme, gimme, gimme situation where I'm doing personally well and I don't care how much it hurts other people. And the thing is, that's why men need to be in charge, because they actually do care about things like justice and nobility and virtue and codes of honor and so on that protect the vulnerable and weak in actuality. So that's how I would combine Jordan Peterson, Nick Freitas, Sargon, Andrew Clavin, and so on, basically.